My 19-year-old son fell in love with a woman older than me, and I feel like I'm losing him. I never imagined I'd be writing something like this. If someone had told me a year ago that my teenage son would fall in love with a woman older than me, I would have laughed and called it impossible. But today I'm sitting alone in my kitchen, staring at my phone, wondering if I've already lost the only family I have left. I'm a 42-year-old widow. My husband died when our son was only 7 years old. Since then, it's always been just the two of us against the world. I worked 2 jobs, skipped vacations, and sacrificed everything to give him the future his father never got to see. Now he's 19. He just got accepted into one of the best aircraft engineering programs in our state. He has his own car, a part-time job, and a bright future ahead of him. I couldn't have been prouder. Then 4 months ago, everything changed. My son came downstairs one Friday evening wearing a shirt I'd never seen before. His hair was styled differently. He even smelled like expensive cologne. I smiled. "So, who's the lucky girl?" He froze for a second before grinning. "She's just a friend," I laughed. "Right. Since when do guys wear cologne for friends?" He rolled his eyes and left without answering. Honestly, I was happy. He'd never had a serious girlfriend before. He'd always been focused on school and airplanes. As a kid, he'd spend hours building model aircraft at the kitchen table. I figured he had finally met someone special. For the next couple of weeks, he was barely home. Every evening he'd say the same thing: "I'm hanging out with a friend." His phone never left his hand. He smiled at messages. He stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning texting. I thought it was cute, at least, at first. Then I started noticing little changes. He stopped talking about university. He stopped discussing internships. He even skipped Sunday dinner with me twice, something he'd never done before. Whenever I asked where he was going, he'd simply smile. "You worry too much, Mom." Maybe I did. After losing my husband, worrying became second nature. Still, something didn't feel right. One Saturday afternoon, I was grocery shopping when I spotted my son's car parked outside the shopping center. I smiled. What a coincidence. I figured I'd surprise him and maybe we'd grab coffee together before heading home. I walked through the parking lot until I saw him. He was standing beside a blonde woman. At first, I assumed she was asking him for directions. Then she reached up, straightened his collar, and kissed him. Not a quick peck, a real kiss. My heart stopped. I couldn't understand what I was looking at. The woman looked older, much older, at least 40, maybe more. Before I could process anything, my son turned around and saw me. His face went completely pale. "Mom," the woman smiled warmly as if nothing about the situation was unusual. "Oh, you must be his mother." She walked toward me confidently and held out her hand. "Hi, I'm Rachel. It's so nice to finally meet you." Finally, my mind was racing. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't he told me? I looked from her to my son, then back at her. She had expensive clothes, designer handbag, perfect makeup. Her face looked unusually smooth, almost like she'd had cosmetic work done. Standing next to my son, they didn't look like a couple. They looked like a mother shopping with her son, and that's when I realized this wasn't just some older college student. This woman was older than me. Mom. She's 43. For a few seconds, nobody said a word. I just stood there staring at her, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood what I'd just seen. Maybe she was his boss. Maybe she was a family friend. Maybe there was some explanation that would make all of this make sense. Then my son broke the silence. "Mom. This is Rachel." He looked nervous, which immediately told me everything. I forced a smile. "How old are you?" The question slipped out before I could stop myself. Rachel didn't seem offended. Instead, she smiled politely. "I'm 43. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. 43. She wasn't just older than my son, she was 24 years older than him. She was older than I was. I looked at my son, expecting him to laugh and say it was some kind of prank. Instead, he reached for her hand. They intertwined their fingers. "We're together, Mom." I couldn't speak. My entire body felt numb. I mumbled something about needing to get home, turned around, and walked back to my car. The second I closed the door, I burst into tears. That night he came home around 10 p.m. I was waiting for him in the kitchen. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, I asked, "How long has this been going on?" "Almost a month." "A month, and you never thought to tell me?" "I knew you'd react like this." I shook my head. "She's older than me, so," I repeated. "She's lived an entire adult life before you even graduated high school," he sighed. "Age doesn't matter." "It absolutely does." He leaned back in his chair. "You don't even know her. Then tell me about her." He smiled in a way I hadn't seen before. "She's amazing." "What does she do?" "She owns a small beauty clinic. Does she have children? He hesitated, then quietly said, 3. I stared at him. 3, he nodded. The oldest is 22. I honestly thought I'd misheard him. 22, yeah, so her oldest child is older than you. He looked away. Only by a few years. I couldn't believe we were even having this conversation. Over the next few weeks, things only became stranger. He was never home anymore. Whenever he wasn't at work, he was with Rachel. He stopped eating dinner with me, stopped watching movies with me, stopped talking about school. Instead, every conversation somehow came back to her. Rachel loves this restaurant. Rachel thinks I should grow my hair longer. Rachel says I should dress differently. One evening he walked downstairs wearing clothes I'd never seen before. They looked expensive. I asked where he got them. Rachel bought them. That answer made my stomach sink, not because of the clothes, but because everything about him seemed to be changing. His style, his routine, his priorities, even his personality. The boy I'd raised suddenly felt like someone I barely recognized, and deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this relationship was moving much faster than either of them wanted to admit. I don't want kids anymore. A few days later, my son and I were having breakfast before he left for work. For the first time in weeks, it was just the two of us. I thought maybe this was my chance to reconnect with him. We started talking about his future, his engineering program, his dream job, the kinds of aircraft he hoped to work on one day. For a moment, it felt like everything was normal again. Then I smiled and said, "You used to tell your dad you wanted twin boys someday." He didn't smile back. Instead, he casually shrugged. "I've changed my mind," I frowned. "About what?" "I don't want kids anymore." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. "You've wanted children since you were 10. Not anymore." "Since when?" He looked down at his coffee. "I've just grown up." His answer didn't sit right with me. Just a few months earlier, he'd been talking about becoming a young father someday. Now he was acting as if he'd never wanted children at all. I couldn't ignore the obvious connection. Rachel couldn't have any more children. Had he really changed his biggest dream that quickly? Or was he changing himself to fit into her life? I wanted to ask. But I knew it would only turn into another argument. As the weeks passed, more little changes started appearing. One evening, I noticed a small black shopping bag sitting on the kitchen counter. Inside was a tattoo studio brochure. When he came home, I held it up. "Thinking about getting a tattoo?" He smiled. "Yeah," that alone surprised me. He'd always hated tattoos. When he was 16, he'd even told me, "I don't think I'd ever put something permanent on my body." "What are you getting?" I asked. He hesitated for just a second. "Rachel's initials." I honestly thought he was kidding. "You've been dating for 4 months, I know, and you already want her initials tattooed on your body?" "I love her." I took a deep breath. "Love isn't a race." His expression immediately changed. "You don't understand." "No," I replied quietly. "I don't." That night I couldn't sleep. Every memory kept replaying in my head. The little boy who built model airplanes in our garage, the teenager who dreamed about graduating from college, the son who used to tell me everything. Now, he was planning tattoos. Talking about moving in with a woman twice his age, and acting like his entire future had changed in the span of a few months. I wasn't just worried anymore, I was terrified. Because for the first time in his life, I felt like someone else had become the most important person in his world, and I had no idea how to get my son back, if you can't accept her. "You'll lose me too." A week later, my son came home looking happier than I'd seen him in months. For a second, I hoped things were finally settling down. Then he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." I immediately felt a knot form in my stomach. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "Rachel wants me to move in with her." I froze. "What? I've been staying there a lot anyway, it just makes sense." "No, it doesn't." He rubbed the back of his neck. "She has enough space, and her children, they're fine with it." I stared at him. "One of her children is older than you." "I know, and the youngest, he's 13. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you're planning to move into a house where you'll be living with a 13-year-old boy, who's almost young enough to think you're his older brother," he sighed. "You keep making it sound weird." "I'm not making it sound weird," I replied. "I'm describing exactly what it is." The conversation quickly turned into another argument. I asked him if he had really thought this through. "What about university?" "I'll still go." "What about your engineering degree?" "I'll finish it." "What about your future?" "My future is with Rachel." Those words hit me harder than I expected. "You've only known her for 4 months. When you know, you know." I shook my head. "No, sometimes you don't." He stood up from the table. "You've never even tried to get to know her." "I don't need to." "Why?" "Because she's a 43-year-old woman dating a 19-year-old. his jaw tightened. You only care about her age. No, I care that everything about your life has changed since she came into it. He looked away for a moment before quietly saying, She's the first person who's ever made me feel completely understood. That sentence caught me off guard. I wanted to ask what he meant. Had he been unhappy all this time? Had I missed something? But before I could speak, he continued, If you keep trying to make me choose, he paused. I'll choose her. The room went completely silent. He looked me straight in the eyes. I love you, Mom, but if you can't accept Rachel, then I guess you'll lose me too. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and walked out the front door. I stood there listening to his car pull away, wondering if that was the moment our family truly started falling apart. I saw a side of my son I'd never seen before. After our argument, the house felt unbearably quiet. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for my son to come home. I already knew where he was. Rachel's apartment. The next few days were almost unbearable. He barely answered my texts. When he did, his replies were short. I'm busy. Talk later. Everything's fine. That was it. No phone calls, no conversations, nothing. It felt like the little boy who used to tell me every detail about his day had disappeared overnight. About a week later, he finally came by the house to pick up some clothes. I wasn't going to waste the opportunity. I asked if we could just sit down and talk. To my surprise, he agreed. For nearly an hour, we spoke without shouting. I asked him what he saw in Rachel. His entire face lit up. She actually listens to me. I listen to you. No, Mom, you hear me. She understands me. That sentence stung more than I expected. He continued, She never judges me. She believes in me. She treats me like an equal. I stayed quiet. Then I asked, Does she ever encourage you to spend time with people your own age? He frowned. What does that have to do with anything? I'm just asking. She says most people my age are immature. That answer immediately caught my attention. What about your friends? I don't really talk to them anymore. Why not? He shrugged. We just grew apart. I knew that wasn't entirely true. Just a few months earlier, he had a close group of friends from college. Now, none of them seemed to be around. Before leaving, he mentioned something that made my heart sink even further. I deleted you from Instagram. I looked at him. I noticed. I didn't want drama in the comments, so instead you removed your own mother. It was easier. That single word hurt more than any argument we'd had. As he picked up his bags, I noticed something on the side of his neck, another dark purple mark, then another near his collarbone. He caught me looking and quickly pulled his shirt higher. I looked away. He was an adult. His private life wasn't my business. But seeing him covered in love bites almost every time he came home made me realize just how intense this relationship had become. As he reached the front door, I quietly asked one last question. Are you really happy? He smiled, not the polite smile he'd been giving me lately, a genuine one. I've never been happier. Then he walked out. I watched his car disappear down the street. And for the first time, a thought crossed my mind that terrified me. What if this wasn't just a phase? What if I really was watching my son build a life that no longer included me? The truth about Rachel started coming out a few days later. My phone rang while I was at work. It was my sister. We don't talk often, so I knew something had to be wrong. Have you seen your son's Facebook? My stomach dropped. He removed me months ago. She went quiet for a second. I don't think you'd want to see what's being posted. When I got home that evening, I borrowed my neighbor's laptop and searched for Rachel's profile instead. Her account was public. The first photo I saw made my chest tighten. It was a picture of Rachel and my son at a restaurant. His arm was wrapped around her waist, both of them smiling at the camera. The caption read, "Finally found the love I waited my whole life for." There were hundreds of comments. Some people congratulated them, others questioned the age gap. Rachel had replied to several of those comments. Love doesn't have an age. He's an adult. That's all that matters. I kept scrolling. Vacation photos, dinner dates. Pictures of them holding hands. It looked like they'd been together forever, not just a few months. Then I noticed something that caught my attention. Almost every recent picture included my son. But none included her children. That seemed strange. A few days later, my son stopped by the house again. This time, he wasn't just picking up clothes. He wanted to collect some of the things from his old bedroom. His books, his gaming console, even the framed photo of him and his dad that had always sat on his desk. As we packed the boxes in silence, I finally asked, "So, when are you moving?" He didn't hesitate. "Next weekend." The words hit me harder than I expected. "You're really doing this?" He nodded. "I've signed everything. You've already signed a lease. It's Rachel's apartment. I'm just moving in. Everything had already been decided, without telling me, without asking for advice. Without even giving me time to process it, as he carried another box toward the front door, he stopped. I don't want us to keep fighting, neither do I. But if this is going to work, he looked me straight in the eyes, you have to respect my decision. I wanted to argue, I wanted to tell him he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But looking at him, I realized nothing I said was getting through anymore, so instead I simply whispered, I just don't want to lose my son, for the first time in months. His eyes filled with tears, but before either of us could say another word, his phone buzzed, he looked at the screen, smiled, and quietly said, Rachel's here. He picked up the last box, walked out the front door, and I watched my only child leave home, not for college, not for a new job, but to start a life with a woman who was older than his own mother. I finally met Rachel. And the conversation didn't go the way I expected. For almost 2 weeks after my son moved out, the house felt painfully empty. His bedroom was spotless, his closet was almost bare. Even the sound of his car pulling into the driveway was gone. I kept hoping he'd stop by for dinner or call just to chat. Instead, our conversations were limited to the occasional text. Hope you're okay, I'm fine. That was usually where they ended. Then one Saturday afternoon my phone rang. It was my son. Mom, would you be willing to meet Rachel? Just the three of us. I hesitated. Every part of me wanted to say no, but another part of me knew this might be my only chance to understand what was really happening, so I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe on the other side of town. Rachel was already there when I arrived. She stood up, smiled politely, and offered me a hug. I wasn't ready for that. I simply shook her hand and sat down. The first few minutes were painfully awkward. We talked about the weather, my son's university classes, work, anything except the obvious. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. I know you don't like me. I looked at her honestly. I don't know you well enough to dislike you, she nodded, but you don't approve. No. I don't, she didn't argue. Instead, she quietly said, I understand why. That wasn't the response I expected. She continued, if my daughter came home at 19 with someone my age, I'd probably react exactly the same way. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I asked the question that had been weighing on my mind for months. What do you see in my son? She looked over at him before answering. I see someone who's kind, respectful, funny, and incredibly mature. Then she added, I didn't go looking for someone younger. We met by accident, became friends, and things developed from there. I listened carefully. She spoke calmly. She never raised her voice. She never tried to convince me that I was wrong. But none of that changed the one thing I couldn't get past, the age gap. When the conversation was ending, I looked directly at her. If he wakes up 5 years from now and realizes he wants children, what happens then? For the first time since we'd sat down, Rachel didn't have an answer. She looked down at her coffee. My son reached over and squeezed her hand. Then he looked at me and quietly said, I've already made my choice. Those words stayed with me the entire drive home. Because whether I liked it or not, my son wasn't asking for my permission anymore. He was asking me to decide whether I wanted to remain a part of his life. The phone call that changed everything. About 3 weeks passed after our meeting. I kept my distance. I stopped bringing up Rachel. I stopped trying to convince my son to leave the relationship. For the first time in months, I decided to simply be his mother instead of trying to fix his life. Then one Tuesday evening my phone rang. It was my son. His voice sounded different, quiet, almost shaken. Mom, are you home? Yes, can I come over? Of course. Less than 20 minutes later, I heard his car pull into the driveway. When I opened the front door, he looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't shaved in days. For the first time since moving out, he didn't look happy. We sat in the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee between us. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. You were right about one thing. I looked at him carefully. What do you mean? He rubbed his face with both hands. Living together isn't as easy as I thought. I didn't interrupt. He continued. I guess I imagined it would feel like we were always on vacation. Instead, it felt like real life, bills, responsibilities, schedules. Rachel's teenage son wasn't thrilled about sharing his home with someone he'd only known a few months. Her older children had mixed feelings too. Some welcomed him, others barely acknowledged him. I didn't think it would be this complicated, he admitted. I nodded slowly. Relationships usually are. He gave a small, tired smile. Yeah. I'm figuring that out. For the next hour, we talked about everything except breaking up. He never said he regretted moving in. He never said he wanted to leave Rachel. He simply admitted that reality was much harder than the fantasy he'd imagined. Before he left, I walked him to the front door. He hugged me, It was the first real hug we'd shared in months. "I've missed you, Mom," my eyes filled with tears. "I've missed you too." As he pulled away, I quietly said, "You know, no matter what happens between you and Rachel, this will always be your home." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled, got into his car, and drove away. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I'd lost my son forever. Maybe we still disagreed. Maybe I still couldn't understand his relationship, but at least we were finally talking again. 6 months later, everything changed again. 6 months passed. Life settled into a routine I never expected. My son was still living with Rachel. He was doing well in his engineering program, working part-time, and somehow balancing everything better than I thought he would. To my surprise, he hadn't gotten the tattoo. When I asked about it one day, he smiled awkwardly. I decided to wait. I didn't push for an explanation. I was just relieved he hadn't rushed into something permanent. Although I still wasn't comfortable with the relationship, I made a decision. If I wanted to stay in my son's life, I had to stop turning every conversation into a debate. So instead of asking about Rachel, I asked about his classes, his exams, his projects, his plans for the future. Little by little, he started calling me more often. Sometimes we'd talk for an hour. Sometimes he'd even stop by just to have dinner. It wasn't like old times, but it was something. One evening, while we were washing the dishes together, he suddenly said, "You know, Rachel and I had a big argument last week." I stayed calm. "What happened?" He shrugged. "Nothing dramatic. We just realized we're at completely different stages in life." I didn't say a word. He continued, "She wants to slow down. I feel like my life is just getting started." That was the first time I'd heard him admit something I'd been thinking for months. Not that they didn't love each other, but that love alone couldn't erase the difference in where they were in life. A few weeks later, he invited me over for dinner. Rachel was there. So was her youngest son. The evening was surprisingly normal. We talked, we laughed a little, no one argued, no one brought up the age gap. As I was leaving, Rachel walked me to the front door. She quietly said, "I know you'll probably never approve of us." I looked at her honestly. "I still don't," she nodded. "I didn't expect you to." Then she added something I wasn't expecting. "But thank you for not making him choose anymore." I looked back toward the dining room where my son was clearing the table. For months, I'd been terrified that I was losing him forever. Now I realized something important. I couldn't control his choices. I could only control whether he felt safe coming home, and maybe that was enough. The day I finally got my son back, a little over a year has passed since I first discovered my 19-year-old son was dating a woman older than me. When I look back at the person I was on that first day, I barely recognize her. I remember sitting in my car outside the shopping center, crying so hard I couldn't even drive home. I remember thinking my son had thrown his entire future away. I was convinced that within a few months he'd drop out of college, lose touch with everyone who cared about him, and completely disappear from my life. I truly believed I had already lost him. Looking back now, I realized that fear was controlling every decision I made. The harder I tried to pull him back, the harder he pushed me away. Every conversation became an argument. Every phone call ended in silence. Every visit felt shorter than the last. For months, it felt like I was mourning someone who was still alive. Life, however, has a strange way of teaching lessons that no one prepares you for. About 9 months after moving in together, things between my son and Rachel slowly began to change. There wasn't one dramatic fight, no cheating, no screaming matches. Instead, it was dozens of little moments that slowly added up. Rachel was thinking about slowing down, traveling less, and planning for retirement over the next decade. My son, on the other hand, was just beginning his adult life. He wanted internships, late-night study sessions, weekend road trips with friends, building a career, buying his first home one day, eventually becoming a father. For the first time, he admitted to himself that love couldn't erase the fact that they wanted completely different futures. One evening, he called me. His voice sounded calmer than it had in months. "Mom, can we have dinner tomorrow?" I said yes before he even finished asking. The next evening, he walked into the house carrying nothing but a small backpack. It felt strangely familiar. For a second, I saw the little boy who used to run through that same front door after school every afternoon. We cooked dinner together. Neither of us mentioned Rachel. Neither of us talked about the breakup. Instead, we laughed over an old family recipe his father used to make. It was the first time in over a year that the house actually felt like home again. After dinner, we sat in the backyard watching the sun go down. Finally, he broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." I looked at him. You don't owe me anything, I do. He stared down at his hands. I stopped listening to you because I thought you were trying to control my life. I quietly replied, I wasn't trying to control you. I was terrified of losing you. He nodded slowly. I know that now. Then he looked up and smiled. You never stopped answering my calls. You never stopped telling me I had a home here. Even when I was angry with you, I felt tears filling my eyes. You're my son. Nothing was ever going to change that. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I've learned something this past year. What's that? Real love shouldn't require you to give up who you are. He admitted that somewhere along the way. He'd stopped making decisions for himself. He'd changed the way he dressed, changed his routines, almost got a tattoo he wasn't sure he even wanted, even convinced himself that he no longer wanted children. Not because his dreams had truly changed, but because he wanted the relationship to work. That realization broke my heart, not because I wanted to be right, but because I never wanted my son to lose himself for anyone. Today, he's still studying aircraft engineering. He's doing well at university. He's spending time with friends again. He's rebuilding the life he'd temporarily put on hold. As for Rachel, I don't hate her. I honestly don't think she set out to hurt my son. I believe they genuinely cared about each other. But sometimes caring about someone isn't enough to build a lifetime together. Some relationships teach you lessons instead of lasting forever. Maybe that's what this was. If this past year taught me anything, it's this: you can't choose your adult children's path. You can't protect them from every mistake. Sometimes they need to live through the experience themselves. The only thing you can control is whether they'll still feel safe coming home when life doesn't go according to plan. And when my son walked through that front door again, I realized something. I hadn't lost him after all. I'd simply been waiting for him to find his own way back. A few weeks later, something happened that I never expected. One Sunday morning, my son knocked on my front door carrying 2 bags of groceries. I looked at him, confused. He smiled and said, I thought maybe we could have lunch together. Just like we used to. For the first time in over a year, the house felt alive again. We spent the afternoon cooking, laughing, and talking about everything we'd missed. He told me about his classes, the projects he was working on, and how excited he was for the future. Then, after a long silence, he looked at me and said, Mom, do you remember when I told you I didn't want kids anymore? I nodded. He smiled softly. I was lying to myself. I still want a family someday. I still want to be a dad. I just convinced myself I didn't because I wanted that relationship to work. I didn't say a word. I simply reached across the table and held his hand. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I pushed you away. I smiled through my tears. There was never a world where I was going to stop being your mom, he laughed, and there was never a world where I was going to stop needing you. In that moment, I realized something. Sometimes life doesn't give you the ending you imagined. Sometimes it gives you the ending you needed. My son had found his way back, not because I forced him to, but because I left the door open. And as I watched him laugh in the kitchen again, I knew one thing for certain. No matter how old our children become, home should always be the place they know they can return to.